Hello and welcome back to Reality Check. I'm Ross Coulthart, and this week we're delving into SETI, the organisation that handles the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And just to introduce this, 74 years ago in 1950, a physicist by the name of Enrico Fermi was sitting in the canteen at the Los Alamos National Laboratory canteen, and he was having lunch. And he posited with his colleagues, if the universe is as vast as we understand it is, and there must be technological advanced civilizations out there in vast numbers, where the hell are the aliens? And it's a very good question. And SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, has been asking that question for quite a number of decades now. It started out as NASA funded, and then the bean counters cut that funding. And thanks very much, particularly to Microsoft's Paul Allen, there's been funding that has continued to keep the SETI Institute going. And the current CEO of the SETI Institute and president is Bill Diamond. And Bill's hugely experienced in photonics, optical communications. He's worked across venture-backed startups and huge multinationals. And he's also worked in X-ray and semiconductor processing technologies. And he joins us now. Bill, welcome to Reality Check.
Ross, wonderful to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So, Bill, can I first get you to give me, I was trying to figure it out this morning as I was going through my research. I was trying to figure out, is SETI just focused on radio waves, observing the spectrum of radio wave transmissions coming from the universe, or is it also looking at optical signals?
Well, it's actually doing both of those, but also more. So the SETI Institute is, its name brand activity, if you will, is SETI, which is an endeavor using modern technology to look for engineered phenomena in interstellar space, basically beyond our solar system, which would serve as a proxy for life and intelligence. And that phenomena could be a radio transmission, it could be a laser pulse, it could be laser communication or lasers used for propulsion. But since the Institute's founding 40 years ago, the search for signs of technology or signs or evidence of engineered phenomena has broadened to include what we now call technosignatures. And a technosignature could include even some bizarre phenomena that we observe that appears to maybe be something like a Dyson sphere or some engineered structure surrounding its host star to provide a planet with boundless energy. So we use both optical telescopes and radio telescopes to look for specific kinds of electromagnetic phenomena. But then more broadly, we're involved in the field of so-called astrobiology, which is the study of life in the universe, which really starts with basic questions about what is a habitable planet, how does life start, under what conditions, and where else might those conditions exist where we could find even basic life, and perhaps even in our own solar system. These could be, microbes or even multicellular organisms.
Now, back in 2004, astronomer Seth Shostak made a prediction that I suspect he'll rue he ever made. Never make a bet about astronomy. And he bet basically, or he predicted in 2004, that he expected to get a conclusive signal and proof of alien contact sometime between 2020 and 2025 based on the Drake equation. And to date, there's been no such evidence. The Drake equation, of course, is a calculation by Frank Drake, one of the originators, the conceivers of the SETI idea, that essentially, when you look at all of the variables that exist in the universe, there's an extremely high likelihood that there are technologically advanced civilizations out there. Now, to date, of course, we're coming up to 2025 very, very soon. As best as we understand it, Bill, unless you guys are hiding something, there's been no evidence. So are we looking for the wrong thing? Is there something we're missing that might be hindering that search?
Sure. I think I share Seth's perspective that we are probably on the cusp of making such a discovery. But I would say that's as much to do with simply deploying more technologies, more capable technologies, more eyes and ears on the sky, if you will, at more times of day and night and in more places in the world than ever before. So that increases the odds. But we do have a fundamental limit that I think is not really something people understand. And that is um, the planet that we're on, Earth, has been emitting electromagnetic signals in the form of radio and then television and other types of communication. Now, even things like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, although very low energy. But we've been doing this for 100 years. So we're 100 years into being, quote unquote, a technological civilization, if we think of the invention of the radio as starting that clock. And if we were to be looking for another planet like Earth that is simply leaking radiation of this kind at fairly low energies and in all directions, using the instruments we have today, radio telescopes, including some of the most sensitive in the world, we'd only be able to find a similar kind of planet doing similar kinds of things within 10 or 20 light years, which isn't very far. Our own galaxy.
Why is that, Bill? What are the constraints on our technology?
Sensitivity, just the kind of energy levels of the electromagnetic radiation that we generate from Earth. It dissipates rapidly, and so it's too weak to transmit across vast distances of space.
So the closest star, I think, is Alpha Centauri. Is Alpha Centauri close enough for us to be able to detect radio transmissions that might be being emitted from that cluster?
Yeah, so if there were similar levels of radio transmission or electromagnetic phenomena at similar energies to what we produce coming from that location, yes, we could detect it. And similarly, part of the premise of SETI is the notion that a sufficiently advanced civilization may actually be, particularly broadcasting high energy, targeted radio waves or optical signals that, would have sufficient energy to be detected across the galaxy even. So it isn't as though our search is only limited to 10 or 20 light years out. It's just that if we were, looking for other examples of a planet like Earth where we are not actually directing high energy beacons across the galaxy, then, we can only locate quite nearby planets.
Now, Bill, one of my favorite movies is Contact, the Jodie Foster movie that's set, I think it's set around Arecibo, the Puerto Rico dish. And I think it also uses the Very Large Array down in New Mexico. Yeah. And it's such an inspiring movie talking about the possibilities of extraterrestrial intelligence attempting to communicate with our planet. And the thing that I loved in that film was it postulated a White House that meddles. And I remember there was a villain called, I think, Drumfeld. Mm-hmm. And he's the bad guy who's trying to stop Jodie Foster from being the one that goes on the mission. And it's all these religious fundamentalists in the Congress who are offended by the idea that, there might be aliens, and they're trying to conceal it from the public. Tell me, sir, what protections do you have in place? Do you promise me if you find an extraterrestrial techno signature, are you going to have some cad from the White House on your shoulder saying, you are not going to tell the public about this? Tell us, what's the procedure in place, Bill? How does it happen?
Sure. Well, that's a great question. We get that question all the time. We are not a government agency. We do have government funding from NASA and from the National Science Foundation and other government organizations for some of the work we do, but not for SETI, not for the work we do with radio and optical telescopes. That's all privately funded. So the government has no control over what we do. We own our own telescope array. We use the Very Large Array. Actually, it wasn't being used for SETI at the time of the movie Contact. It had never been used for SETI, but we actually have a project on the VLA right now, which is maybe the most comprehensive SETI program ever undertaken by the human species. We can talk more about that later. But our protocol, first and foremost, would be that if we made an observation of a signal which A, appeared to be, a technical engineered phenomenon, not something that nature produces, and B, was perceived by our instruments to be from beyond our solar system, so something, from another star system, beyond our own, then step one would be to get another radio observatory elsewhere on the planet to point their instruments at the same place and see if they see or hear the same phenomena. And part of the reason for doing that is that if we're looking at something and we think it's fairly far away, and another telescope in another part of the Earth looks in the same coordinates we give them and get the same signal, that verifies that it's far away. If we give them the same coordinates and they don't see it, that's because it's coming from closer by. And then we would know, oh, this must be a satellite or, some other local phenomena. So step one, verification. Step two, announcement. But the announcement, I think, in the traditions of science, would be as fact-based and informationally accurate as possible, with perhaps, minimum speculation. In other words, we would say, this is what we have observed. We appear to have received a signal from whatever, let's say 20 light years from Earth, and it is this kind of a signal. It is modulated in this manner. It appears to contain information, or at the very least, it appears to be something clearly engineered and not something nature produces. And therefore it is, likely evidence of an alien technology. And so people say, well, would you be allowed to do that? If you were preparing to make such an announcement, would somebody step in and stop you? Of course, I can't predict what some future administration may or may not do, but, they wouldn't have any inside track on what we were about to do or say. We're not under any obligation to make any advance notifications to any government agency about any discovery we might make. So they would have no, heads up that this was coming. Secondly, I say this somewhat tongue in cheek, but I say to people, look, if you're concerned about that, the thing to do is to surround our building off of our property with cameras looking at our building at all times. And if you ever see a bunch of black Escalades pull up with a bunch of people with suits and earpieces and lapel pins pop out, you might assume that we got a signal. So, but no, we're pretty free and clear.
As you would probably know, we take a very close interest in Reality Check on the suspicion or the idea of a cover-up in government on the issue of UAPs. And I do. I do think the US government knows a lot more than it's letting on. I've got sources who tell me we have recovered non-human technology. Let me ask you this question. There's one thing that's always intrigued me, because I'm a keen fan. My brain can't quite get my head around it, but I'm a keen fan of the implications of quantum technology. And let me just work through this with you, and please shout at me if I say anything wrong here. As I understand it, there's a phenomenon in quantum science of quantum teleportation, which relies on the so-called entanglement of particles to transmit quantum information instantaneously and securely. And this entanglement of particles is so cool, and it's almost magic, because if you've got one particle here and another particle, say at Alpha Centauri, light years away, they would instantaneously do the same thing. Now, I looked online because I've always been intrigued by the possibility that this might be the way that aliens communicate. That here we are on the cusp of this amazing discovery about quantum telecommunication, the possibility that there is this other way of communicating that doesn't use radio waves or even visible light in the optical spectrum. And so is there that possibility? I hear different arguments online. There's a whole Reddit string that says, no, quantum communication is not possible. It's absolutely not possible. You can't go faster than light. And then I was reading about this team of scientists from Edinburgh's School of Physics and Astronomy, and they have mathematically calculated that quantum communications across interstellar space should be possible. And they've used math to describe the movement of X-rays across a medium, such as that travels between stars, And they looked to see if their calculations could show the degree of decoherence that might occur during such a journey. And their math shows that space is clean enough to allow such interstellar quantum communications. So X-ray photographs could travel hundreds of thousands of light years without losing their coherence. Does this mean that there might be a form of communication that we're currently not looking for, quantum communication? And is there any way, Bill, of detecting it?
Sure. Well, it's a great question, and I'm not familiar with the paper you referenced from Scotland, but quantum entanglement is something that it occurs on a quantum scale. So we're talking about subatomic particles and their state, for example, their spin state, and how particles at vast distances, even across the length of the galaxy, never mind between here and Alpha Centauri, if they're entangled, can basically duplicate each other's state. Now, I'm not sure that entanglement provides the same ability to transmit information as we think about when we talk about transmitting information or teleporting information, because we're just talking about quantum states being entangled and instantaneously happening across vast distances. I think it's fair to say that we are sufficiently ignorant of the possibilities of things like quantum entanglement or quantum communications to say whether or not that would be a phenomena that we could look for. I think it's fair to say that at any given moment in time, we are only able to deploy the technologies that we have at our disposal to look for phenomena that we already understand and know about. And so, and when you think about, our existence as a technological civilization and being, 100 years old, we think that statistically speaking, the probability or the likelihood is if we do find evidence of an extraterrestrial civilization, they'd be most certainly much older than we are. Because the probability of 200-year-old civilizations finding one another in a 15 billion year old universe is like zero. But so they might be 1,000 years or 20 or 50,000, and I think it's difficult to imagine what kind of physics and deeper understanding they have of the natural world and its phenomena than we do. So one of the things we're endeavoring to do, for example, at the moment, is bring together theoretical physicists and SETI scientists and sort of reimagine SETI techniques and technologies based on different ideas of how information might get sent from point A to point B, and so forth. So I think it's fair to say that our search techniques and modalities are very limited. They're limited to technologies we have and understand, and that there are certainly going to be discoveries made in the decades ahead and centuries ahead that may completely turn on its head the science, if you will, and technology of SETI searches.
I am delighted to announce that we have a sponsor on Reality Check, and that sponsor is none other than a martial arts god that when I was a little boy, I worshipped intensely. I had his posters on my wall, and he inspired me to learn karate and other martial arts as a young teenager. I'm talking about Chuck Norris. When I was a little boy, there was one movie that I went to watch about 5 times in 1972 called The Way of the Dragon. And it was Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris facing off against each other in the Colosseum in Rome. It was just mighty stuff. And would you believe Chuck Norris is now 84 years old? And while I have broken hands and knees and ankles because of my foolish interest in karate, whacking boards in a dojo late into the night, Chuck Norris's body defies explanation. The man is 84 years old, and yet he's still got the vigor of a man 30 or 40 years younger than him. He's still kicking butt and working out. And what's amazing is he's stronger, he can work out longer, and has plenty of energy left over for his grandkids. He did this, he tells us, by making one change. And he says he still feels like he's in his 50s. His wife's even done the same thing as well, and she's never felt better. She says she feels 10 years younger. Her body looks leaner, and she has energy all day. And Chuck's made a special video that explains everything. And make sure you help us and Chuck by watching it if you go to chuckdefense.com/Ross and click in the link below in this video. It'll change the way you think about your health. Now, once again, that's chuckdefense.com/Ross. Click on the link in the description below to watch the video. You won't believe how simple it is. Just a reminder, the legendary Chuck Norris is a whopping 84 years old, and yet he's got more energy than me. And his body may be broken, but for some reason, he seems to be able to keep on going. I want to know his secret. I'm going to click on that link. What he's discovered that he could effect dramatic changes to his health simply focusing on 3 things that sabotage our body as we age. Watch his method by clicking on the link in the box below, chuckdefense.com/Ross. Broadly speaking, putting the quantum communications question aside for a moment, I guess what you're conceding there is the possibility that the aliens are using a technology that we just don't know about yet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, think about, even what we now call optical SETI, the idea of looking in space for optical phenomena, specifically lasers. Lasers are also a very effective form of communication or propulsion or information transfer. We have a laser up the street from us here in Mountain View at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and that is the world's most powerful laser used for high energy basically fusion, energy fusion research. And if you took the output of that laser and bounced it off of one of our 8-meter telescope mirrors on Earth and shot it into space, it would be 10,000 times brighter than the sun. So, lasers are, like radio waves, become an interesting phenomena to look for, but we couldn't have looked for them before we invented the laser and even knew such a thing existed. So, what kinds of technologies that have that capability to transmit information or just be observed from great distances, have we yet to develop or create that we could ultimately look for? So yes, I think at any given point in time, we're going to be limited to the physics and the technologies that we understand and have access to in terms of what we look for and how we go about that effort.
Just coming back to the quantum thing for a moment, you might be interested to know that the Edinburgh scientist, who's a guy called Latham Boyle, and he speculated that for interstellar quantum communication to occur, the wavelengths of the photons must be less than 26.5 centimeters to avoid interference with cosmic microwave background radiation. Mm-hmm. And he calculated that the telescope would have to be 100 kilometers in diameter. So you got any budget there for a 100-kilometer diameter telescope, Bill?
Not at our immediate disposal. However, the notion of telescopes that big, is surprisingly not just the stuff of science fiction. Once you start talking about constructing things in space, scales like that are, not so crazy as they may sound. And of course, to build a 100-kilometer telescope on Earth would be impossible, just structurally impossible. But to build it in space where there's no gravity, you don't need, a big, strong, supportive frame or, things like that. So you can take, mylar thin films and create any shape you want and make it absolutely enormous. So it's not as crazy as it sounds, but it would be, if we talk about, having to build it on Earth, yeah, there are some constraints there that would make it difficult.
Now, one thing I wanted to ask you about, and please, I know you're being a really good sort by asking some of my questions because I'm really fascinated in this area. And one of the things that I was intrigued about, I was reading about something called Albi, astronomically long baseline interferometry. And there's speculation that you could actually link telescopes across astronomical distances, creating what's called an effective angular resolution. Essentially, you can create a gigantic telescope. And it was speculated when I was looking at this quantum communication idea, I was going to ask you about this possibility that maybe the aliens are just using a different type of telephone.
For sure.
And I read somewhere online that there is this speculation that you can use this interferometry to build a notionally large telescope. Is that something that's, you believe, possible? Is it something that you'd contemplate as a possibility if we could get the resources to do it?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, so right now in radio astronomy, we already use arrays. And we have the Allen Telescope Array. You referenced Paul Allen first. That's the Institute's own array. It's 42 dishes. Each one is a separate dish, but they all act like one big dish. And they are integrated and collimated together so that they act in unison. And we can focus each one of those 42 dishes on precisely the same phenomena that we wish to observe. The Very Large Array in New Mexico is even bigger. Each telescope there is 25 meters across, and there's 27 of them, and they're spread over a distance about 23 miles across. And but they also have the VLBA, the Very Large Baseline Array, which combines some of the telescopes at the VLA with other radio telescopes across the United States in different locations, again, to function as a single large integrated instrument. So really all we're talking about is scaling phenomena and technology that we already know quite a lot about and we know how to do. One of the complexities about radio or even optical elements being far apart in terms of radio transmission, it's timing the data so that, when you're transmitting data from one telescope thousands of miles away and you've got another telescope that's right in your backyard where your computers are, you have to time the observations precisely. Otherwise, you don't have an array. You don't have an integrated instrument. You have something looking at two different points in time. So there are complexities, but we understand them. We know how to do them. And so if you just say, okay, well, let's scale it up. Let's put a dish on the moon and then function that as an arrayed instrument with an instrument on the ground. And then you can scale beyond that. Well, okay, we could start using other bodies in the solar system. So it's not to say it's trivial nor inexpensive by any stretch, but it's absolutely technically feasible. And it's just scaling up something we already do and know how to do.
Now, Bill, we had the wonderful Professor Avi Loeb from the Galileo project on this show a few months ago. And he was talking about the Oumuamua object that he's taken a huge interest in, which he speculated might be an artificial object because it didn't follow a normal kind of elliptical track through the solar system. And I read somewhere that SETI was used to direct its technology at the Oumuamua object to see whether there was any kind of emission that could be detected. As I understand it, you didn't find any evidence of ET.
No, we didn't. Of course, what's interesting that there are, of course, images or drawings that people have imagined of what Oumuamua looks like based on information we have. In reality, Oumuamua for astronomers was no more than a single pixel on a display. And just by looking at how that pixel changed in brightness, depending on when you were looking at it and so forth, we could determine a lot about it. But we couldn't see anything like, an actual structure. We could only infer its shape and size based on the way light was reflected off of this pixel. And there were no, radio emissions, at least that we could detect, coming from that object. So, I think, of course, when you're interested, as we absolutely share Avi's enthusiasm for this endeavor. And I think we're as passionate as he is about, how exciting and interesting this is. But I think we have to be careful about inferring too much, making too many conclusions based on scant evidence for what we're observing. And just because something doesn't move or behave in a manner that we expect, I don't think is a sufficient reason to draw the conclusion that, well, therefore it must be engineered. We've discovered all kinds of things that we didn't expect that would, for example, have defied our previous understandings of astrophysics, only to, realize these are normal. So, for example, the first exoplanets found were huge Jupiter-sized planets zipping around their host stars in a matter of days. And we would have thought, that's not even possible. So, but it is, and it's a natural phenomena. These are not spacecraft; they're big planets. So, I think it's always interesting to speculate on what could be. I think it's dangerous to declare what is based on very, let's say, scant information.
You just gave me the perfect segue into what I want to go on to next, because again, the wow signal has been an exact example, apparently, of exactly what you're just talking about. This idea that as our understanding of science develops, we do find explanations or possible explanations for what might originally have been thought to be an artificial signal. So just to give our audience a bit of background, in 1977, 15th of August, Ohio State University's Big Ear telescope picked up the so-called wow signal. And there was a scientist called Jerry Eman who wrote the word wow on a computer printout. And it was not an ordinary signal, an extremely powerful signal, in fact, in a protected area of radio technology. It looked technological, and it didn't appear to be of human origin. And I have to admit, Bill, I was crushed a few weeks ago when I read that it's now being suggested that the wow signal is not what we hoped it might be. It's not ET. Can you please explain?
Yes, well, of course, it was very exciting at the time. I mean, why the words wow were written on the margins of this computer printout. And, another thing some in the audience may not be familiar is that we used to get data on printouts instead of screens, so we're talking about a long time ago. And data was, astronomical observational data was strings of letters and numbers, printed across this green and dark and light green shaded paper. And there was this string of numbers on one line of the printout that when the astronomer went back to look at the printout in the morning to see what was seen, overnight, there was just this string that said, well, this is not normal. This is high energy. It's a particular frequency. Wow. So you just, like, as one does when maybe reading something interesting, you make a note to yourself in the margins. He wrote the word wow and put exclamation point. The problem, of course, is at that time, there was no way to do anything like an immediate follow-up, or, there was nobody on duty to have the telescope, trace and track that and notify other observatories to maybe take a look. There probably weren't so many radio observatories at that time in any case. So, it's almost certain that what was seen was, a man-made, human-made phenomena. Could have been a satellite, could have been an aircraft, something along those lines. I mean, this is the one of the big challenges of SETI, is dealing with the vastly noisy radio frequency, so-called RF environment that we live in. That is, a noisy RF environment created by our own technology. So we really are at a needle in a haystack kind of endeavor with this kind of research.
I think there's a paper that I was reading about from the Planetary Habitability Lab at the University of Puerto Rico at Arecibo. And they did observations between 2017 and 2020, and they found wow-like signals near the hydrogen frequency spectrum of 1420 that looks exactly like wow. And this is why they're now hypothesizing that a transient radio source, and they think it might be some kind of magnetar firing or a soft gamma ray repeater, some kind of neutron star, suddenly flared in the radio spectrum. And their hypothesis is that if it's in the right proximity to a cold hydrogen cloud, it could explain the wow signal. So it's not definitive, but that was the crushing paper that I read that suggested that they dismissed the idea, interestingly enough, that it might be a human transmission, but they were suggesting that it might just be a natural occurrence that essentially amplified a signal.
It could certainly be. I mean, and it isn't the first time we've had phenomena like that we've observed. And, we have even recently, in partnership with the Green Bank radio telescope at the Green Bank National Radio Astronomy Observatory, we've simultaneously observed the location coordinates for the WOW signal and, not seen anything. So it is almost certainly some either natural phenomena as described in the paper, or, a man-made transient that could have been, in low Earth orbit. It's hard to say with any certainty at this point. But an intriguing and much more recent analog to this is something called Tabby star, which you may have heard of.
Can you pronounce that? Sorry?
Tabby. It's Tabitha, and it's named for a young undergraduate student astronomer at Yale University. And what she was doing was looking at data from the Kepler Space Telescope mission. That was a NASA mission that was run out of the NASA Ames Research Center right down the street from us. And actually the SETI Institute managed the data pipeline for that mission. And we wrote the algorithms for planet detection. The purpose of that mission was to find so-called exosolar planets, and in other words, planets around other stars. It did that using the so-called transit method. Basically look at a star and look at its brightness and stare at it for a long time, i.e. years. And if you have instruments that are sensitive enough to look at just the slightest amount of dimming of the light from that star that might be because of a planet transiting in front of it in our line of sight, and you see that happening with a regular periodicity or frequency, you might infer that this is a planet going around the star. And so that was the fundamental technology or idea behind the Kepler mission. Now, bear in mind, an Earth-like planet transiting a sun-like star would only dim the observed light from our sun, if it was being observed by somebody on Alpha Centauri, for example, by 1 part in 10,000. So very, very tiny amount. So very hard to see. Even a Jupiter-sized planet would be 1 part in 1,000. So just a slight dimming of a star, which you're still observing in the field of view of this telescope as a tiny little point. So extraordinary measurements. But there was a particular observation of a particular star in which this young woman discovered hidden in the data that there was something periodically dimming the light of this star by 20%, not 1/10,000th or 1/1000th, but 20%. And that gave rise to all kinds of speculation that it might be, for example, a Dyson sphere or some, engineered technology. And for the longest time, many, many months, I think maybe even more than a couple of years, there was no better explanation. Astronomers and astrophysicists were trying all kinds of ways to explain this than the idea that it might be an engineered phenomena. But, certainly there was a lot of skepticism that this might be the case. And now the prevailing theory, which, has been backed by a lot of analysis and mathematics and so forth, is that this is a cloud of dust that is moving around in an orbit that is blocking the light, which is disappointing if true. But it's another example of things that are unexpected and at least initially unexplained by our own understanding of physics and cosmology, and then turn out to be nature at work.
Do you find it frustrating, Bill, that you're doing a job where you've got one goal and you've been doing it now? I mean, obviously SETI's been doing it now for decades, but both with and without government funding, or with diminishing or diminution of government funding at different times. But there's obviously the one goal is obviously to discover extraterrestrial intelligence.
Right.
There's all these disappointments. I mean, you've just given me another one there. The WOW signal's another disappointment. I mean, do you ever feel like it's a futile task?
Well, I think the answer to its ultimate futility would lie in whether or not there are such extraterrestrial advanced civilizations out there. And what's interesting is, in only the last 15 years, do we now have irrefutable proof that planets are ubiquitous. We didn't know that. We hadn't even discovered planets outside of our own solar system until the mid-1990s. And it wasn't even until a few years later that we discovered that's what they were, was other planets. Now, thanks largely to the Kepler mission, we know that every star in the sky is in fact not a star. It's a solar system, that every star in the sky statistically has one or more planets around it. And we also know from that same mission that approximately 20 or even 30%, possibly even more, are rocky Earth-like planets within the so-called habitable zone of their host star, where the energy level isn't too great or too little, and would theoretically support liquid water, which we feel is a fundamental ingredient for biology as we know it. And so you do the math, and that suggests that within our own galaxy, which is one of hundreds of billions of others, there are tens of billions of potentially habitable worlds. So that's a game-changing bit of new knowledge. And one could argue that, well, for the first 25 years of the Institute's history, we didn't even know if there were other planets. We were just hoping there might be. Well, now we know there are. And I think and it seems like the more we learn, the more it is sort of statistically inevitable that there is life, and even intelligent life, beyond Earth. Another way to put it is the statistical probability that we are alone in the universe is zero. So I think that compels us to do the search, even if our techniques and technologies are somewhat primitive or somewhat limited. But we in the cosmic time scale, we haven't been at this for very long, right? 40 years in a 4 billion year old planet and a 15 billion year old universe is just nothing at all. So we have a long way to go before I think we'd be ready to hang it up and say we quit.
Now, when we, as an advanced technological civilization, engage with primitive, or how do we say this, indigenous communities that are less technologically advanced than us, we often have a non-interference policy. And, there are tribes all around the earth where we basically leave them alone. They're incredibly remote. And it makes me think of the Prime Directive in Star Trek.
Right.
Captain Kirk and Spock, they have this policy that they're very strict about. And I think Gene Roddenberry, when he wrote Star Trek, I think he had some insights because he was connected to Navy intelligence. And it's very, very interesting, because is it possible, or do you think it's actually likely, that the aliens that do exist, those advanced technological civilizations out there, they know full well we're looking for them. They just don't want us to know about them just yet.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, one of the things I'm like self-trained to be in this job is open-minded, right? So I would, I don't believe in invoking absolutes like absolutely not or absolutely yes. Anything's possible. And certainly, we are as a species on our own planet, sort of invoking this policy of non-interference. But we've only been doing that in modern times, right? I mean, we clearly in our past, we've had other examples of, more advanced civilizations interacting with less advanced civilizations and civilizations, and the results not going very well for the less developed populations. So it is certainly, I think, promising to see that, in modern times, we've realized that, the Prime Directive, do not interfere, is really the right approach. So is it possible that there are civilizations out there that know we are here, and not so much that they don't want us to know that they're there, but rather they don't want to interfere with us, or, be disrupting our own, evolutionary processes? It's possible. I would kind of hope that, since it appears that in the course of a civilization moving from being agrarian to industrial to ultimately technological, there are unintended consequences that come along with our technology that are, in fact, in many ways, an existential threat to our own existence over, the long-term future. And in that case, I almost feel like, well, if there are more advanced civilizations who've solved those problems, and they know we're here, and they observe that we're having these problems, it'd be great if they came and helped us out. But that's maybe wishful thinking.
Now, Bill, I'm in regional New South Wales in Australia, and only a few hours away across the outback, there's a place called the Parkes Observatory that I'm sure you know well.
We do.
And I spoke to a few of the blokes there who are friends of mine, and they asked me to give you a prod because they have a nostalgia for a project that I'm sure you know well called SETI at Home.
Yes.
And it was a project, I think it ran until 2021. I think you ran out of money in the end, but it didn't get any results. But they have a beef. They've got a real issue with you lot there at SETI. They think you're Northern Hemisphere focused and they're Southern Hemisphere. And down here on the bottom of the Earth, we have a beef. You haven't been looking for life in the southern part of the hemisphere. And at one stage, it was being mooted that the Parkes Observatory might be involved in a new SETI at Home project where amateur astronomers sitting at home would be able to use software that would allow them to search for possibly artificial signals, and that the Parkes Observatory might be a focus for that. Is there any, it was being mooted a few years ago that they might restore the SETI at Home project because there is a real nostalgia for it amongst a lot of astronomers, including down here in Australia. Is there any possibility that might be resuscitated?
Sure. Well, lots of different elements to that question, starting with Parkes. So yes, we know the group at Parkes very well. We have coordinated with them on SETI observations in the past. They have been part of a consortium effort in a project called the Breakthrough Listen Initiative. And Dr. Andrew Simeon is the head of the Breakthrough Listen Initiative here in the US. He also heads SETI programs at the SETI Institute. And the Breakthrough Initiative has used some of its funding to get time on the Parkes telescope to do observations, SETI observations from the Southern Hemisphere. And the Southern Hemisphere has the advantage over the Northern Hemisphere that you can look directly at the galactic center, which is the more crowded part of the galaxy.
Yeah, we think we're superior down here, Bill. So
well, in terms of night sky and a place to look, it's absolutely correct. Now, at the same time, your listeners at south of the equator will be maybe pleased to learn that the two biggest, most capable modern radio telescope arrays are being built in the Southern Hemisphere. One in Australia, the Square Kilometre Array, and the other in South Africa, Meerkat, and they are both part of the Square Kilometre Array consortium. And we are working with both of those organizations to try and also get programs to do SETI. The newer way of doing SETI on existing instruments, instead of buying time and then having a limited opportunity to look at a certain place, is to do what's called commensal observations. And that means wherever their telescope is pointed at, which is usually going to be at some particular phenomena, capture the whole field of view and send that set of data to a different set of computers that are designed to find SETI phenomena as opposed to looking at a particular astronomical phenomena. And so we're working with different radio telescopes. We'd love to work with Parkes in that manner as well. We have a project on the Very Large Array I mentioned earlier where we are doing just that. And the amount of data we are generating is extraordinary. It's on the order of 3 terabytes per second. So it's massive. And therein lies one of the problems with SETI at Home or doing SETI now as a citizen science project. And it's in some cases like this, I'm glad to be able to say actually that the SETI at Home wasn't a SETI Institute project because I don't want anybody mad at us for no longer supporting it. But at the same time, I'm kind of sorry that it wasn't ours because it's so famous. And it's actually one of the first demonstrations of distributed computing on the history of our planet. So it's really innovative. It was done by UC Berkeley. And in fact, UC Berkeley here in California and the SETI Institute have long worked together. And we both built the Allen Telescope Array together. And Andrew is based at Berkeley. So there's lots of ties there. We are looking at, and by the way, SETI at Home didn't involve citizen science because we weren't asking people to actually do any data analytics. We were really taking advantage of their computers and letting them, there's this screensaver operate in the background to help with the computational elements. But people loved it. And I get people coming up to me from all corners of our planet, from India, from China, from Africa, and so on, saying, oh, I used to do SETI at Home. So we are looking at, SETI at Home 2.0, where this would more likely be like an app on the phone or something that you could access through your laptop or computer, which would give you access to certain data sets that might then allow you to play with them. What we have to deal with is just how large these data sets are now, where to store them, how to give people access to them. If you're talking about doing something where you want to access terabytes of data, most people's cell phones and laptops can't do that very easily. So we are working on a way to bring SETI data into the hands of citizen scientists and reimagine and relaunch SETI at Home, which we'd all love to do. So stay tuned, and maybe we can have a future conversation where we're launching that, and it'll be very exciting.
That's wonderful news, Bill. I'm sure you'll make a lot of astronomers down here very happy. Let's move on. You've got SETI, which of course is a passive system. You're listening for techno signatures from the universe. And then there's METI. There's the active SETI, messages to extraterrestrial intelligence. Where do you stand on that? Obviously, there's a huge philosophical argument in astronomy and indeed in politics. Should we be letting the aliens know we're here?
Yes. So I would say that from a logical perspective, and just a logical perspective, I might argue in support of METI proposers, in that if you want to find evidence of technological civilizations, tell them we're here, say hello, like send out a beacon. And so from a logical point of view, that's actually a very good way to, try and engage some other civilization, because they would know we're here, even though it might take a long time for our message to reach a potential advanced civilization. But the counter argument for that is one that there are very strong feelings about on both sides. There are strong proponents for and very strong proponents against doing METI. And the argument against is, you might not like who you wake up or who, becomes aware of your existence, and, they might come and do us harm. And even, the renowned physicist Stephen Hawking was very much opposed to, the idea of being METI. Well, there's lots of interesting elements to this. One is that if the world's best minds and some of our greatest scientists have that concern, it also tells me that they firmly believe there's technological civilizations beyond Earth. Otherwise, they wouldn't care. So the greatest minds on our planet, I think, are all convinced that there's likely to be extraterrestrial intelligence out there somewhere. But
what's your view, though? Where do you stand?
Well, okay. So where we stand is, as an institution, and again, in particular, also getting government funding, we are not going to do something that would be viewed as highly controversial and by some as actually dangerous, just because we believe it's a logical thing to do. So our official position is we don't do METI. We are not going to do METI, and we will not do METI, until there's more of a global consensus on, hey, this actually might be an interesting thing to do. What we do want to do and intend to do, however, is to be the place where conversations of this kind happen, where we bring people together and say, well, let's talk about the merits for and the merits against, and so on. I will say that personally, I don't believe in the so-called dark forest theory that is at the heart of the don't transmit argument, because they'll come and do harm, and because that is the nature of beings. My personal feeling is, because of what I mentioned earlier about the potential existential threats we have created by virtue of our own technological developments, e.g. climate change or, harnessing the atom, et cetera, that, if there's a technological civilization that is thousands of years old, they have probably gone through the same phase in their evolution or in their existence that we're in now, i.e. they've solved the problems that were the result of their own becoming technological. They've, found energy sources that don't, have the same consequences as either, nuclear or fossil fuel or things of this sort. They've solved problems of sustainability and waste management and resource consumption. And therefore, they've only been able to do that, I surmise, by being cooperative with one another. At some point, they realized we're all on this planet together. This is one island. And if we don't start cooperating together instead of killing one another, we're going to kill ourselves by virtue of our own unintentional technologies. So I feel if a civilization makes that transition to unite and to solve its problems together, and also to come up with the technologies or capabilities to address those problems, there's nothing we have that they would need. They're more likely to be benevolent than malevolent, because you can't be, I don't think, evil fundamentally and cooperate as a global civilization. So I don't necessarily subscribe to the dark forest theorem, but I respect the opinions of those who do. And I feel that I also respect this notion of who gets to speak for planet Earth, who should have the right and the ability to do something like transmit, and if transmitting, to be responsible for what is in that transmission. So with that in mind, we stay away from METI. We are more than happy and interested to talk about it. And again, I have my own perspectives on what I think about advanced civilizations, but it's a very interesting area.
Now, Bill, I'm going to invite you now to be hugely controversial. I want you to take a swipe at the blokes that run the James Webb Telescope, because there are a lot of people contacting me and they're pushing a conspiracy theory. James Webb now been operational for quite a while, and we're only getting one image a week, one bloody image a week. They're not releasing that much information. And I want to tell you, I've got people telling me on the inside that there is an extraordinary amount of data coming in that's not being publicly shared. Now, we've all paid for the James Webb Telescope. It's been a wholehearted gesture of goodwill from the public to fund public science. Are they sharing? And on that principle, just to prod you a little bit, we know we've got hundreds of billions of dollars worth of detection systems in the military that are funded, and you've got NASA doing the similar thing, including with James Webb. Are they sharing with you? And do you think they tell you? I mean, you're a not-for-profit, very wholeheartedly generous organization that's run on the smell of an oily rag and full of goodwill to do the right thing. Are you at all confident that you're being shared the information that ought properly to be being shared in the interests of public science?
Sure. Well, a couple of things about James Webb is that one of its missions is observational astronomy, so to take pictures, to take images, and then to share those image data sets with the scientific public. However, another part of its mission, and this is the reason why the mirrors are not silver, but they're gold, as you'll note, and your audience will note. And that is because they're optimized for the infrared part of the electromagnetic spectrum. So gold mirrors will reflect infrared wavelength light more efficiently than silver. And the reason that infrared is interesting is because one of the capabilities of James Webb is to do what we call molecular spectroscopy on exoplanet atmospheres. So for planets which are sufficiently close, within a couple dozen light years, the James Webb Telescope can actually look through their atmospheres, with the starlight from the host star, shining through those atmospheres, and then looking with infrared detectors on the James Webb Telescope at these infrared wavelengths, and where so-called absorption peaks happen, or where light gets absorbed at certain wavelengths, that tells us what the composition of those atmospheres are. Does the atmosphere have water and hydrogen and nitrogen and carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, things like that? And so one of the reasons we're not just getting a stream of image data is because there's these other data sets from James Webb, and there have already been papers published using those data, suggesting the possibility of biology on certain planets because of what's been discovered in the atmospheres. These atmospheric, say, so-called fingerprints of what might be life, we call biosignatures. So we would say that, this particular composition of an atmosphere would be difficult to explain without the presence of some life form on the planet's surface. And, there have been some very interesting discoveries that have been, written up in the scientific literature, suggesting the possibility that, some of these may be a result of life. So I know that a lot of data is getting generated. We have people on James Webb. So based on your provocative question, I will seek their counsel on what is the issue with image data sets from James Webb and how frequently they're being distributed. All of NASA data is open source. That's the policy. The military is, of course, different, and they're not under any obligation to share anything with any of us, least of all the SETI Institute. But NASA is, to your point, it's a taxpayer-funded, public entity, and it serves the scientific community. Now, there are times when telescopes are used by scientists to perform certain experiments because the scientist has a certain theory or area of research they're working on. And in some cases, because the scientist has secured time on the telescope, the data associated with their observations is not made public until the scientist has the opportunity to take it, look at it, understand whether there's something new here, publish a paper. And, so you get this so-called embargo period sometimes where the data that's informing certain kinds of research has a delay before it gets shared with the public because, a scientist wants to be able to see, is this supporting my theory, or can I use this in my research? Is there a new and exciting discovery or paper here to be written? So I can't either confirm nor deny this notion that there's only one image a week. I find that somewhat hard to believe, but I will confirm with my team here and check that out. But those would be the issues that might limit what people are seeing in the short term coming from the telescope.
It does beg the question, though, Bill. You mentioned the military does have phenomenal optical technology, and a lot of it's looking out towards space. I didn't realize this until I spoke to friends of mine who've actually seen what's going on at Pine Gap here in Australia, where we do have a lot of ballistic warning, looking for ICBMs being operated by the Chinese, the Russians, or the North Koreans to look for imminent launches. But apparently we've also got satellites looking out into space, and those military satellites are highly classified. Do they ever share with an organization like you? Is there any kind of cross-pollination where somebody from the military comes and says, oh, do you guys want to have a look at this? It's quite interesting. Or really, is there that level of secrecy? Do you think they would ever tell you if they found evidence of an extraterrestrial civilization?
Yeah, so it is interesting with military assets that are used for observations in our own airspace, or pointing up or pointing down. That I think there are situations where they would like to share data or information. We've had certain conversations along those lines, but in many cases, the hesitation to share information is not because what the information contains at all, but rather we don't want this organization or that organization or these people in a different country to know our capabilities. They don't want to know the capabilities of these instruments and how sensitive they are, how capable they are. And if we share this data, even though it's not data that's interesting to us or has anything to do with national security, someone will say, oh my God, look at the capability of this instrument. So that's usually the issue, I think, around more of the, let's say, intelligence or military-based assets of this kind is, they don't want to share information, even if it's scientifically interesting, in concerns over, inadvertently sharing information about the technology behind those data.
Now, Bill, you implied at the very beginning of our conversation that you had other projects that you wanted to tell us about. Is there some new issue that SETI's up to that we should know about?
Well, we do have, I mentioned the Cosmic Project on the Very Large Array. That is really extraordinary. I mentioned that as being perhaps the most comprehensive SETI endeavor ever undertaken so far, because it is using certainly the most powerful or sensitive and capable radio telescope on the northern hemisphere. The new arrays in the southern hemisphere will at some point be more capable than the VLA. But NRAO hopes to build the next generation VLA, so we'll come back to that in the future. But it's also using an extraordinarily sensitive instrument with a wider frequency range than anything else we've ever deployed for SETI purposes, and it's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it's generating. We're able to process massive amounts of data because of modern compute technologies and so on. So where's
the receiver for this, Bill?
This is the very large array. So this is the big telescopes in New Mexico, and the data processing for it is on site. So essentially, we went in with NRAO and we built new backends to those telescopes. Each telescope now has 2 optical fibers coming off the back of this 27 dish array. One set of fibers goes to the computers of NRAO, and the other set comes to our computers. They're capturing the information about a phenomena that they're looking at, usually some point in the sky. We're capturing the entire field of view. So imagine looking through binoculars at a hummingbird, but processing all the information around that hummingbird in high resolution and all the time. And that's what we're doing. So it's generating, as I mentioned, the like 3 terabytes of data per second. And so it's a huge new SETI project. And we hope to replicate that kind of commensal observation on these new radio telescopes in the southern hemisphere and elsewhere. We're also involved in conversations about putting a radio telescope on the far side of the moon. And the reason for that is because that would be a radio quiet area. As I mentioned earlier, the biggest problem we have as radio astronomers looking for faint radio signals from beyond our solar system is all the radio signals not within our own Earth's orbit and atmosphere and immediate surroundings. I mean, we're surrounded by microwave ovens, garage door openers, cell phones, cell towers, radio, TV, etc. So it's an extraordinarily noisy environment. And so you put radio telescopes in remote locations for the same reason you put optical telescopes on high mountains, to get rid of the things that make observations difficult. In our case, it's radio interference. For optical instruments, it's light and atmospheric density. So that's an interesting project is these commensal observations. But the interesting project of putting a telescope on the backside of the moon gets around this problem of radio interference. And so that's a very serious discussion we're now having. How much would it cost? Launch capability now is much more affordable than it used to be. Building, designing, and deploying a dish that you could put on the far side and have it self-deploy and open up. And, all of these kinds of technologies are within our grasp. Becomes a budgetary issue. So that's very exciting. And then we have an optical SETI program called Laser SETI, where we have built these special cameras with 2 lenses for each camera system and putting multiple camera systems on sites around the world to do what we call all sky, all the time observations, looking for laser pulses or optical phenomena that are engineered versus natural. And that's again a very comprehensive project, given that it's global. All sky, all the time is the ultimate objective there. We have 3 observatories. We'll cover most of the sky once we have 6, but the ultimate idea is to have as many as 12 different places around the world deploying that technology, which could be very interesting.
Wrapping up, Bill, you've been in the job now for a year or 2. Is there Is there going to come a day soon, you think, when you're going to be able to put out a press release and say, we think we've found it? Give me some hope, sir.
Yes. Well, so 2 parallel efforts are ongoing. One, of course, is looking for even the most basic signs of life within our own solar system. We are part of those endeavors. And I think, quite honestly, that within the next 10 or 15 years, we may actually be in a position where we're saying, yes, there's other life, even in our own solar system. We can't have a conversation with it. It's not advanced life necessarily. It could be intelligent life, maybe under the frozen surface of Enceladus or Europa. I do think that, finding evidence of life, even within our own solar system, is within our grasp in a fairly short period of time. And it will be extraordinarily profound as well, because especially if that life has a unique biogenesis. In other words, if it has nothing to do, it emerged on its own, and with nothing to do with the emergence of life on Earth. The implications of that would be, okay, it's like game over. Life is going to be found everywhere. I have a quote, which someday I hope to be attributed to me, which is: the most remarkable thing we may discover about life is that it's not remarkable at all. Not that it isn't interesting, but it isn't, that it's everywhere, and it happens at every possible opportunity. So that, I think, is imminent. In terms of the discovery of intelligent technological life, this is a tough one, because we could make an announcement next week. We could make an announcement next year. It could be 10 years. It could be 20. But I do think, because we are deploying more advanced technologies and more sensitive technologies, we're able to do things faster and more cleverly than ever before. Yes, it could be soon. One maybe quick word about artificial intelligence and how that's allowing us to change the way we look for SETI signals. So if we're looking for a narrowband radio frequency signal, which has been the traditional thing we've been looking for in SETI, then we are looking for a very specific phenomena, and we're ignoring anything else, right? And therefore we're confining our search to something, very specific. And ET could be doing something completely different. Now, here's another approach. Take those same radio telescopes and train an AI to understand the radio background environment in its entirety all the time, and find anything different, anything unusual or anomalous. That's a much more comprehensive technique, because it might find something weird that's wideband and not narrowband, or,
So
who knows?
we're not doing that at the moment.
We are now starting to use AI tools to do SETI observations exactly in that manner. In other words, don't look for a particular phenomena, rather computationally and mathematically and from an AI perspective, understand, the background reality, and then tell me anything you see that's different. And that's a very, very powerful new capability.
So, Bill Diamond, you've just given me a glorious reason for optimism that someday soon you're going to step up to a lectern, and even though those dastardly Drumfields or whoever they are in the White House are trying to stop you, you strike me as a decent bloke. You're going to reveal all and tell us the truth about the ETs out there. And there's reason for optimism, because with modern AI, we're going to find things we previously didn't even think possible.
Absolutely.
So, sir, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing this time with us. And I wish you the very, very best with SETI in the future.
Thank you very much, Ross. It's been a great pleasure.
Thanks for watching. Go to joinnn.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And please don't forget to click that red subscribe button to ensure you get more of NewsNation's unbiased and fact-driven news coverage.